thank you all very much for coming to listen to me talk about my book Downstairs at the White House, particularly on a Friday afternoon. I know that the alcohol had absolutely nothing to do with it, but I will tell you this, keep drinking because the speech will get better the more you drink as you go through it. Trust me on that one. Now, I want to let you know, and I don't like to brag about it too much, but that you really did come to see not just your average Joe today. And the reason that that's the case is that I am indeed, and it's kind of hard to get your head around, but I was the backup Easter bunny at the White House in 1974. That sadly is true. And I want to tell you about that. On Easter Monday, 1974, walk back with me to those days. I was minding my own business. I was running an area of the White House Easter egg roll, populated by a slew of tiny barbarians with the collective attention span of a gnat. We had Porky Pig there. He was getting on my nerves, and I wanted to strangle a kid who had taken God knows what and had come up to me and decided to use me as a human towel and put his hands on my leg and left me with brown stains on my suit and everything else. So I was ready. I had had enough of it, and on my way back to the East Wing, just as my shift from hell had ended, I saw the woman who was in charge of the Easter event. We called her the bunny boss in those days. And she was standing near the starting line for the egg races. And she waved at me. And I waved back happily. And then I noticed that her wave was more like this. It was like, come here. And so I walked over, and she looked me over from head to toe. And then she said, there's a problem. The Easter bunny, she said, wasn't feeling well. She was overheated. Now, you could live your entire life and never hear anybody utter those words, okay? And that would be a good thing, I can assure you. I have to say, in all honesty, that I was probably not anybody's first choice to be the backup Easter bunny. I was an unknown quantity as an Easter bunny. And there was probably a clue that my patience was unraveling when my first words to the bunny boss were, I can't wait to get the hell out of here. And probably the growing look of horror on my face as I realized what was going to happen didn't help either. I was handed the head and body and given strict instructions that the children couldn't see a disassembled Easter bunny. Frankly, though, I thought about sending a few of the little miscreants into permanent psychotherapy by kicking the bunny head around like a soccer ball. But I thought better about that, and I moved on, and I tried to find a place to be able to change, and I had to make a decision if I was going to strip down to my skivvies or I was just going to put the bunny suit on over my clothes. I don't remember which men's room I decided to go into, but I can tell you that I could not have made possibly a worse choice. Standing inside that restroom were two uniformed Secret Service officers I knew. They took one look at me, and they doubled over in such loud, hysterical laughter that I thought they were going to bring up their intestines. I, in turn, was so embarrassed that I stopped thinking, and I pulled the suit up over my clothing as fast as I could, and trust me when I say that it didn't help when I put on the head. I guess I was assuming maybe I'd hide myself. It was a little bit too late. And then when I looked through the little black screen, that's in those kind of heads, and looked out, I could see that one of the officers was lying on his stomach making whooping noises and slamming his fist on the floor. But then it got worse. To put it politely, the suit was a lot more than warm. I felt like I was trudging across a desert in a cashmere leisure suit. I waddled off to the south lawn, trying to keep my head from wobbling as sweat was literally pouring down my face and my eyes. And I was also trying to keep balance in those weird bunny feet that were unwieldy and making my feet sweat so badly that I was convinced that I was starting to hear splashing noises down below. So the minute I walked out there, I was besieged by children. At least one kid slapped me in the rear, and another who was sitting up on his father's shoulders decided to grab my ears, which hurt because the head slid and it popped me right in the nose. A couple of others asked me to hop, which was utterly out of the question considering that the weight of the head was making me sway backwards and I was getting nauseous at the same time. And to top it all off, I heard a kid scream that he had a jelly bean stuck in his nose, and all I know is that couldn't have been resolved well for anybody in that. I think that I was the Easter bunny for a grand total of about 15 minutes. Of course, though, there in those days, that was not the end of it. People I knew left carrots on my desk and asked me if things were hippity-hoppity. They'd tell me stupid bunny jokes, and even if I looked in the direction of a Secret Service agent, even if I didn't know him, they would break out laughing. And in fact, the only thing that brought that to an end was when President Nixon released the transcripts of the Watergate tapes a few weeks later. And then everybody's conversation in the White House changed. I'm here today and very grateful to be here today because I wrote a book about my experiences as a teenage employee in the White House during Watergate. The book, thankfully, has made, and to my surprise, has made the Amazon bestseller list in political humor and in teen and adult, young adult biography and in memoirs about U.S. presidents. I was able to write that book, however, because of some advice that my father gave me 45 odd years ago. On the day I left for college at the tender age of 17, my dad said, "Son, try things. Go up to people and introduce yourself. Ask them questions." He said, "You may perturb them, but you got to remember one thing. In the end, they can't eat you." Unfortunately, in that hallmark moment between father and son, my dad forgot to mention that they could, however, do a lot of other things to you if you got too far out of line. Nonetheless, it was very good advice, and I'm still kind of surprised that I listened to it. Now, if you've read Downstairs at the White House, you may have noticed that along with heeding my dad's advice about taking risks, my life has resembled that of Forrest Gump. I sort of stumble and have stumbled into unusual, sometimes historic events most of my life, and I have absolutely no idea why. In 1973, I had Bob Hope and Charlton Heston as my wingmen one night in the nation's capital. In 1974, of course, I was in the White House when Richard Nixon resigned the presidency and Gerald Ford took the oath of office. In 1975, I played catch with Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman during a break-in filming of All the President's Men and had absolutely no idea who they were until the next year and the movie came out. In 1981, I was a block away from the Washington Hilton when President Reagan was shot. Some years after that, I got into a wrestling match, as you heard Jennifer mention, with a goat who was standing guard in front of a lavatory door on Aeroflot, the Russian airliner. Tragically, the goat won. In 1989, I was on the other side of a hallway from one of the nation's first workplace mass shootings. But then again in Russia, again in the 1990s, I spent a night in a Siberian insane asylum that was guarded by sheep herders. Literally, they had little hooks, the little sheep herder hooks, and they stood outside. Breakfast was one big jar of prune juice. Not a good way to start the day anywhere. In 1993, I left the World Trade Center in New York 2 hours before terrorists bombed it. And on a flight over the Pacific in 2000, I watched the obligatory movie, whatever United Airlines was showing that day. And when it was over, I turned to the guy sitting next to me, and I said, "Boy, that wasn't exactly the best movie I've ever seen." And then I realized that the guy I was sitting next to was the star of the movie. It turned out that, however, that Gary Sinise was a very nice guy, despite that. On September 11, 2001, I was about 2 miles away when terrorists flew an American Airlines jet into the Pentagon. I felt the earth tremble. I heard American fighters scramble and break the sound barrier as they secured Washington's airspace, and a lot worse. But if I thought any of those odd events were behind me, just the other day I ran into a lady who had read Downstairs at the White House, and she said to me, "Are you the Don Stinson who wrote this book?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And kind of my chest is a little puffed out and the whole thing. And she goes, "Wow, you got old." So with that to set the stage, it's perhaps more understandable when I tell you that I stumbled into a job as a clerk in the old executive office building in the winter of 1973, and that, believe it or not, I didn't realize I was working in the White House complex for the first couple of days. A secretary, as they were called in those days, had to point that out to me, which was hugely embarrassing. I stumbled into that job because I had stumbled into a program that let me stumble from my junior year of high school into my freshman year at American University in the fall of 1972. One morning I was shaving in the dorm. Another guy came in. He started shaving. We had a conversation. He had a job in something that was called the Old Executive Office Building, which I had no idea what that was. He wanted to give it up. I was interested. I interviewed, and I got the job. The rest is history. But in yet another weird twist in all of this story, I had a top secret security clearance in the White House before I was old enough to vote. The FBI interviewed my teachers, friends, neighbors, and even a couple of ex-girlfriends, which I can assure you was very dicey, to say the least. But it was a great job. I worked for an assistant to the president for international economic affairs, who, interestingly enough, was one of the forces behind America's adaptation and use of the space shuttle. I made copies. I delivered mail. I did other things that were absolutely, of course, critical to our national security. Most of all, and for some of you who may be around my age will remember, I became a key operator. Remember that? That meant that I was really cool. And the reason that was because I knew how to fix the Xerox machine that we had that was about the size of a battleship back in those days. And let me tell you something. At that age, with my polyester navy blazer, my 2-foot wide tie, and white pants, I was the man back in those days. One day, I was summoned by the boss's secretary to go and buy 2 Pepsis out of the vending machine and bring them to her immediately. So I arrived at the machine only to find that the Pepsi machine was broken, but the Coke machine worked. So I bought 2 Cokes and I brought them upstairs and I brought them to her. And as I approached, she started turning pale. You know that look in the movies when, like, the first time the person sees the monster? You know, and they're scared. And I had no idea why. I mean, I handed, and she said, "I told you to get Pepsi. You got Coke." I said, "Well, you know, okay, that's all there was. Sorry." And she said, "Okay, you stay right here." And she poured them into glasses and nice thing and walked into the office. And the next second, I heard laughter from inside. And I was summoned into the office, and Peter Flanagan, who was the assistant to the president I worked for, said to me, he goes, "Don, I want you to meet somebody. This is Don Kendall." And I said, you bought Cokes instead of Pepsis, and we were kind of wondering why. I said, "Well, hey, the Pepsi machine didn't work, and I'm from Atlanta, and that's where Coke was invented, and the Coke machine worked, so, and you know what? They all taste the same to me." Said, "Don, do you know what Mr. Kendall does for a living?" "No, I don't know." "He's the chairman of PepsiCo. They make Pepsi-Cola." So, among other brilliant moves, I managed to purchase a Coke for the chairman of Pepsi. As I saw my life pass in front of my eyes, which was quick because I was only 17 at the time, I figured I was history, but both my boss and Mr. Kendall could not have been kinder and more gracious people, which was something that ran throughout the White House in those days. And I'll talk about that some more later. But about a week later, I got a big envelope in the mail filled with Pepsi coupons that Mr. Kendall sent me, and I'm a Pepsi drinker to this day because of it, and frankly, I'm scared not to be. I also had a very odd job that still to this day I don't understand. Nearly every day during the spring and summer of 1973, a lady would come and find me, and I really don't know who she was, and she would hand me an unmarked manila envelope. So it didn't say the White House on it or whatever, but it was addressed usually to a Republican member of the U.S. Senate, and most specifically, usually to a member of the U.S. Senate who was a member of the Senate Watergate Committee. I don't know what was in them, and I knew a lot better than to open them. Frankly, at that age, I was more scared that if my dad heard I had ever opened it, that was scarier than, you know, being sent to the jail by the feds. But I did get to know Barry Goldwater, who was the 1964 presidential nominee of the Republican Party, and Hugh Scott, who was the Senate minority leader, because I sneaked onto a Capitol elevator marked Senators Only and got busted twice. But they were very nice about it. I was the nobody that everybody knew. I was just a guy that kind of blended into the hallway, but they remembered me, and they were very gracious men, and I would later see them on August 7th, 1974, in the West Wing of the White House, as they had just left the Oval Office after informing President Nixon that he had lost support in the Senate and that he would have no choice other to resign. I eventually took another job in the White House. However, I do want to let you know that I spent the taxpayers' dollars well in my remaining time there. I spilled ice water on Frank Sinatra. He lived to talk about it. I got jerked out of a men's room at a very difficult moment by a Secret Service agent who was making room for the Prime Minister of Italy. He and I passed one another, both with a terrified look in our face as that happened. And I had my photo taken numerous times by the FBI as I walked in and out of the Soviet embassy, and that's a whole nother story. Now, among other things that were housed in the old executive office building at that time, in fact, right around the corner from us was the office of the Vice President of the United States. There were, I had to tell you, for me, this was like the baddest thing I had ever seen. There were flags on either side of the doors. The vice presidential flag, the American flag. Above the door was the vice presidential seal. And always, whenever the vice president was in, there were two big guys, really big guys, with guns who stood out in front of it. I thought that was, particularly for a kid, that was the neatest thing in town. One day, I literally ran into a guy who was standing at a water fountain filling up water, a percolator. Remember the coffee percolators? And I caused him to spill it all over himself. Luckily, I found out that he was a speechwriter for Spiro Agnew. And we actually became friends. He forgot about the fact that I had soaked him. And I ended up getting a job in the vice president's correspondence section. I have to tell you that reading mail that folks sent to the vice president of the United States was weird. Of course, I was a kid, so they dumped everything that was weird or, strange on me. One guy wrote a lengthy letter, I'm talking about 5 or 6 pages every week, that was entitled at the top, Cranberries, America's Silent Hero. He wanted to make the cranberry the official vegetable of the United States. It's a fruit, it's not a vegetable, but I decided not to tell him that because I didn't think he'd take it well. A woman wrote that and complained that wearing the Republican Party's elephant symbol on her dress made her look fat and suggested that the GOP use a slimmer animal. Another felt that it was important for us to know that her doctor had given her a shot of something that made her want to take her clothes off and stand naked in front of her picture window. She was 86. There was a family that claimed that they had run into, I'm not making any of this up, I'm telling you. There was a family that claimed that they had run into trouble with visitors from Mars who had relocated to Ohio. And they had taken over the local grocery stores. She said that they could tell that they were Martians because they had big heads and they did a poor job of bagging groceries, which made perfect sense to me at the time. But one day I returned from lunch and I was greeted with a grocery bag that had, I didn't even know you could send one through the mail, and it had stamps all over it, and it was addressed to VP Stinky Agnew, Washington, D.C. Not surprisingly, it didn't have a return address on it. And the first thing, and I opened it up, and the first thing that I saw inside were a pair of broken electric scissors. And then I saw that the scissors were laying on top of a pile of cutout pictures that turned out to be all these weird pornographic pictures. That was moderately creepy. The really disquieting thing, which kind of moved up to an 8 on the, 8 out of 10 on the creepy scale, was that there was a rag in there that was all scrunched up and it had some brown stained material on it that actually kind of looked, I thought it was blood. So I took it immediately, following procedure, and I took it to the Vice Presidential Protective Division of the Secret Service, who were a couple of floors down. I was absolutely sure that I had come across something that was of life and death importance. I have to tell you that none of the agents thought it was very special, and in fact, for them it's Tuesday. We get weird things. And frankly, as I would come to learn later on, and I describe in the book, is that there was, even in the early 1970s, there was a level of weirdness and creepiness in America that was so unnerving that made this grocery bag guy look like a kindergartner. He couldn't even play. One of the agents that I knew, he took the bag, and he turned to me and he said, "Don, I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Hill." And remember that, you think back to when you were that age, my mind was always on food. It was really nothing much else. And so I just went like, "Hi, how are you?" and shook hands with him. And then my friend, the agent, said to me, "Hey, idiot, don't you know who that is?" I said, "No." He goes, "That's Clint Hill." I was speechless. Clint Hill was the first genuine American hero I ever met. I have never known anyone in my life who ever out-heroed Clint Hill. As many of you will remember, on November 22nd, 1963, Special Agent Hill of the United States Secret Service was assigned to protect First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy. He was in a backup car directly behind the limousine carrying President and Mrs. Kennedy and Texas Governor and Mrs. John Connally. When the first shot was fired, Mr. Hill jumped off the running board of the moving Secret Service vehicle, ran to the president's car even as it accelerated, and stepped on the bumper, climbed over the trunk, and threw himself over Mrs. Kennedy and the president, who sadly, tragically, had already been fatally shot. And Mr. Hill did this in a matter of seconds. So for those who grew up in the shadows of that horrible day, Clint Hill's bravery is an indelible part of our collective memories. When I met him in the summer of 1973, he had been promoted to be Assistant Director of the Secret Service. I turned around and I walked back, and I extended my hand a second time, and with very deep respect, I said, "It is a great honor to meet you, sir," and it was one of the great honors of my life. Now, although I didn't appreciate it for quite some time, history was becoming something that was a lot more than just an academic endeavor. I was not only meeting the people who were making history, but people who had made history. Not long after that, I ran into John Connally in the West Wing elevator. He had been seated, as most of you know, in front of President Kennedy when the shots were fired, and the wounds that he sustained that day were part of the Warren Commission's still debated magic bullet theory. So with John Connally and Clint Hill, I had then met two men who had been inside the presidential car on that dark, horrible Friday in 1963. It still gives me shivers today to think about that. I was also at the end of Spiro Agnew's vice presidency. Although he ultimately resigned in the face of federal charges that were related to extortion, bribery, conspiracy, tax fraud, a couple of other problems that he committed when he was governor of Maryland, people aren't aware of the fact that actually he tried to get the House of Representatives to impeach him. In fact, he went to Capitol Hill one afternoon to try to convince Carl Albert, who was then the Speaker of the House, to convene the House Judiciary Committee. Agnew's argument was that the House was the only body that could impeach a vice president for committing high crimes and misdemeanors. And consequently, it was the only body that could investigate charges of high crimes and misdemeanors against him. It was smart politics. The vice president really stood a much better chance of being judged by other politicians than he did by the men and women who could serve on a grand jury. Albert decided to leave the question of whether a sitting vice president, could be indicted. He left that to the courts, and he rejected Agnew's request. But here's yet another interesting historical twist. Guess who it was who immediately came forward to suggest that the House grant Agnew's request for impeachment? It was the Minority Leader, Gerald Ford, who would eventually succeed both Agnew and Nixon, although none of it was in the cards at that time. I knew the Vice President, I knew Mrs. Agnew, I knew one of their daughters, I knew them well enough to feel pain for them. He would ask me how I was doing in college, and he even remembered what I was studying. He also used to tease me about wearing a Spiro Agnew watch, which maybe some of you had, that featured a cartoon depiction of him on the watch face. And all of that meant a lot to me. I had a couple of very surreal experiences when I worked for the vice president that are in the book, if you're interested. But I'll share one of the stories with you. About a month after the vice president resigned, he and Mrs. Agnew threw a party at their house for all of us in the staff, which was both in the White House and Capitol Hill, since he was also president of the Senate, before we all scattered to the winds. And in fact, the news about the party even made Newsweek magazine. I hung around well after everybody else left, mostly because there was a lot of food left over. Had I tried to predict what was going to happen next, I could have never done it in a million years. All of a sudden, I was invited to come sit on the floor with 5 or 6 other people in the living room, and I ended up sitting right across from Spiro Agnew. The former vice president talked for quite a while about his career and what he hoped to do in the future, and a variety of things from Vietnam to the impending oil embargo to Nixon and Watergate, and he even ended up talking about what was then the Baltimore Colts' really lousy 2-5 record so far that year. It struck me, though, during the course of this conversation that went on about an hour or two, that he never uttered an unkind word about anybody or anything. And I'm sure he had a few axes to grind. But he did say something that shocked me. What he said was that he never had really wanted to be president. Now that struck me as very odd. I, I, I couldn't quite understand how anyone wouldn't want to be president of the United States. The honor of holding the highest office in the land alone seemed to be the loftiest of lofty goals and not really a choice. And it took years for me to fully appreciate that conversation with somebody who was the real thing. You know, there are politicians that all, you know, they all try to run for national office at some time, whether you liked him or not, whether you agreed with him, whether you think he did bad things or you don't. He was on a ticket that not only won, but won twice on a national level. And so anyway, I think I learned more about the world and how it works in those 1 or 2 hours and listening to him and some of the other guys than I learned in all 18 years of my life. Now, there's one other little surreal piece to that, and that I happened to be sitting next to a guy that I worked with named Peter Malatesta, who happened to be Bob Hope's nephew. And he started in this conversation saying something about that he and Frank Sinatra were going to give up a house that they had just bought together in Washington. And I had to look twice and blink my eyes because bringing up the name Sinatra, hanging around a living room at night drinking a Pepsi wasn't exactly part of my life. Now, the Nixon administration promised to find us all equivalent jobs in the government if we wanted one, and boy, did I. So this short version of a real long story, because there are twists and turns in it that actually are impossibly funny, is that I ended up working in what was then known as the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And it was a good job, and everything went just great until it didn't. On the Friday afternoon before Christmas, I was focused on a project that was due the first week in January. That the office was empty and it was very quiet. A woman came out of virtually nowhere and bluntly asked me if I had worked in the White House, and I said I did, and she said, I have a problem with that, in one of those kind of deep, hulky kind of voices that sounded like, remember The Exorcist had also come out that year. I was really disturbed by that, and while I wasn't really surprised at anything that she said, she went on to grind axes about several other presidents with an emotional fury that was somewhat like that shower scene in Psycho. Among them was Herbert Hoover, whom she incorrectly assumed was a member of the Hoover family of vacuum cleaner fame. He didn't care about the Depression, she said. He always had a job making sweepers. I wasn't going to correct her. With no clue where any of this was going except downhill real fast, I smiled, I wished her a Merry Christmas, and I stood up and I walked away. She'd been pushing a cart that was loaded with office supplies, and there was a sudden, very sharp pain in my right leg because she used the cart to ram me with it. Merry Christmas, huh? And she explained to me that she didn't want me to forget her over the holidays. Now, as entertaining as that was, violence was only a slight of her vibrant personality. I later heard through the grapevine that she went to the ladies' room every afternoon, locked herself in a toilet stall, slumped against the back wall, and snoozed for an hour. And I have to say that cozying up in, on, or around a commode seemed so natural for her to do that the vision of it didn't even make me blink. Now, strange as it may seem, I left the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare not long after, but not because of her. I had to quit, believe it or not, in order to get paid. The government of the United States of America could not get my Social Security number right. See, I told you I like Forrest Gump. In a beautiful example of bureaucratic entanglement, the best solution that the payroll department of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare could come up with was, you need to quit, because if you quit, then we have to pay you. So I quit. And in yet another weird, strange bounce of timing, I ended up back in the White House. This time in the East Wing as White House messenger. I hope that this kind of gives you a feel for the kinds of things that are in the book. This continues on throughout the entire book, and I have a lot of funny stories about these kinds of things. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to stop now and talk some more, or talk directly about the White House and Richard Nixon and Watergate and the aftermath of all of it. The White House that I worked in 1974 was a very polite, it was a very gracious, and a highly professional place. That was true even in the worst days of Watergate. Although there were always jerks lurking around somewhere, it was even true, the kindness was even true of many of the political people that I knew. although some of them were clearly like a long, slow-moving toothache. I was part of the staff that kept the White House operating and served the president and the first family, regardless who was president. A lot of people I worked with on the House staff, the maids, the butlers, frankly, the people who were the most fun to be around had either been there for a very long time, and most of them had been there for a long time, and as I mentioned, many of them started in the Truman administration. Among the gentlemen I knew was Eugene Allen, who was the head of all butlers in the White House. The movie The Butler that came out, I think it was in 2013, which was very, very, very loosely based on his life. He was an extraordinary fellow. I called him Mr. Allen, and he called me Mr. Stinson. Respect was expected both ways, regardless of who you were and what your station was, and everything was very proper and very buttoned up all the time. That didn't, however, stop some of the people from being comedians or causing some trouble from time to time deep in the bowels of the White House. During the very worst of Watergate, one friend of mine took every opportunity to rub his hands together and recite Sir Walter Scott's famous verse, "Oh, what a tangled web we weave, when first we practice to deceive." At the same time, there was a guy he cleaned the carpets in the West Wing at night, who used to sing the song "Don't Lie to Me." And sometimes late at night, he would sing the words out loud. Most of the people that I worked with in the House staff were African American, and it was interesting because I found myself for the first time in my life as a racial minority. Despite that, negativity only raised its ugly head once. The guys in the office made puking noises when I tried to bust a move that I saw on Soul Train, and their failure to appreciate my artistic interpretation of Jungle Boogie still confuses me to this day. But despite all of that, today's world could indeed take some much needed lessons from those men and women about how to radiate grace and dignity. The folks in the kitchen often took pity on me as an insatiably hungry college student and found a good way to shut me up by giving me leftovers. The big White House kitchen is a kitchen's kitchen. If I was lucky, I could pick up a platter of Duchess potatoes, a dreamy version of mashed potatoes that were made with some kind of magical formula with that, and I could get roast sirloin ends that weren't suitable for serving at formal dinners. Sometimes, if there had been a really big state dinner the night before, there was steamship round that I still think about to this day, being presented with a beautiful glossy, it was a glossy roast that smelled like Christmas. They used to give me little cuts of that. I take it on the bus, and people tried to jump me on occasion with it. I mean, you know, somebody had to eat this stuff, right? I volunteered. I do have to admit, though, that I got cut off on cookies a couple of times because I showed sheer unadulterated gluttony, and the chef wouldn't put up with it. I want to talk about about President and Mrs. Nixon for a minute. The first time I met President Nixon was on the south lawn of the White House, actually. A number of us, and there's a picture of it in the book, a number of us had gone out on the south lawn to wish them farewell as Mrs. Nixon actually went on a trip to South America. And the helicopter was sitting out there, and the Nixons came and they posed for pictures with us that were part of the East Wing staff. And as they were walking towards the helicopter, the president stopped and he went and he pointed like this at me. I didn't know what it was. And I was starting to wise up about things, and I didn't think I would ask. So they got on the helicopter, and you know, the blades started and the whole thing, and they started flying off and a whole bit, and we turned to go back into the White House, and the next thing I was flat on my face because what the President of the United States was trying to tell me was my shoelaces were untied. The next time that I spoke to President Nixon, actually you couldn't call it a conversation. I listened. I used to go into to work in the mornings. I went to school full-time, I worked full-time. And I used to go in through the West Wing, usually carrying a briefcase that was filled with stuff. Believe it or not, back in those days, I carried a briefcase in and walked right past the President of the United States in the morning, and nobody ever looked in it. What I would do is I would walk through the Rose Garden area that you see on television so that I could try to come across the President in the morning so I could say, "Good morning, Mr. President," and that would make my whole day. This one particular day, I just had a book with me, and the book was about Theodore Roosevelt, and it said something on the cover about it, and the president stopped me. And I think the only reason that he did was because he wanted to talk to somebody about something other than Watergate, and I was the only thing nearby that had a pulse. But he went on and started, I can't really tell you how long it was, and he talked about Theodore Roosevelt. And then that branched into a conversation about Winston Churchill. As I stood there, and my knees were kind of shaking together, but one of the things that I noticed about him was that he was absolutely brilliant. However you wanted to look at Watergate, however you wanted to look at any of the other things that may have gone on, he had an absolutely brilliant mind. And I can tell you this much, is that I have never met, I've had the pleasure of meeting and speaking with a number of presidents during my lifetime, that I have never met anybody that had the kind of voltage that President Nixon had. It was almost overwhelming to me, particularly as a young man. Mrs. Nixon was an absolutely lovely lady. I got in trouble yet again. One day I was walking through the residence on the ground floor, and coming back from the West Wing, and I happened to look over in the side, and I saw somebody near the elevator that takes the first family up to their private residence, who was standing there, had a scarf on or something like that, and this voice said to me, "Hey, kiddo," and I went, "Hiya, kiddo, how you doing?" And I went back to, I was then working for part-time for the First Lady's press secretary. And I don't know, a few hours later, I get called on the carpet. "How dare you call the First Lady kiddo? You don't do that." It's like, I didn't know. I thought it was one of the maids. I really did, the whole thing. I'll tell you what kind of lady she was. A couple of days later, the phone rang in the press secretary's office, and she was talking on the phone. And then she said, "Don, come here." And she held out the phone to me, and it was Mrs. Nixon on the phone. And she called to say, "Don't worry about a thing." She goes, "I said that to you. You didn't know who was standing there. Besides, you should have said that to me anyway." And then she went on to ask me about my family and my mom and all sorts of kinds of things like that. But an absolutely lovely, charming woman. It's interesting in White House, and I'm sure it's no different today, that when all the tourists are gone, and boy, those tourists were strange. Some of them, you can read about one that they found a way to never have to stand on a line when they came touring Washington, D.C. because they smelled so bad. But you can read something about that. But the place, when all the tourists are gone, all the events are gone, or everything, the White House is actually almost kind of soundless. And there's something about the air. The first time I went to the Oval Office, and there's a funny story about the kind of condition I was in when I went there, but there was something about it that it felt as if they had been pumping air in to raise the level of oxygen. There was just something that was different. It wasn't the colors that were at that time royal blue and saffron yellow that the Oval Office was decorated in, very vibrant. It wasn't that. It wasn't even the history of the room, but it was this feeling of this lightness and this incredible feeling of the air and perhaps the power that was there at the same time. The White House was like any other office that anybody works in. People have rumors, they spread things, they broke down, they did all kinds of things. And obviously during Watergate, things got more and more emotional for many people who worked there because many of them had given their careers to Richard Nixon, and now they were watching it go away. It was interesting to hear conversations that would go on about so-and-so, I'm worried about so-and-so's wife because he, the husband, is going to prison. And you know, the funny thing is, I went to college with kids who, they weren't exactly Nixon fans. But it's a lot different when you know those people, where you have some kind of relationship to them, like your neighbor or a friend who's in that kind of trouble, and it gives you a different view of the world at that time. The last few days in the White House were absolutely chaotic. Rumors were flying everywhere. Tempers were short. There were some rumors that the president was going to barricade himself in the Oval Office. There was one that got around that he was going to, the Army was coming over to put machine gun nests outside the doors because he was going to try to somehow organize the military to be able to stay in office. And one of the odder things that happened along with that, as if that wasn't enough for you, is that I was given something this was August 8th, 1974, the day before the president left office. And I walked real fast, like most kids do, and I had to traverse the entirety of the White House. And I got over to the West Wing, and I had to take something to the old executive office building, and there were stairs. There's stairs in the West Wing, and I came around them really fast, and I'm hauling, and all of a sudden, because of the difference in elevation, I am standing nose to nose with Gerald Ford. Now, there's a famous photograph of President Nixon and Vice President Ford sitting when President Nixon explained to Vice President Ford that he was going to resign the next day and that Ford would be president. What did I do? The minute that I came nose to nose with Vice President Ford, I said, "Excuse me, Mr. President." That did not go over well. That got back to some bosses, like, "Hey, it was a slip. I made a mistake. There was nothing intentional to it." The night before the president resigned, the place was an absolute circus, primarily because of the press in the press office. Actually, earlier in the evening, I had happened to stroll past the Oval Office and got hollered to by some friends of mine who were taking the furniture out. And actually, I took out the chair that Ford sat in when he found out that he'd be president the next day. You had to take all the furniture out of the room because you had to get those gigantic TV cameras from back in those days in. In fact, only one was allowed at that time, but you had to move everything out. That night, that President Nixon gave his speech to tell the nation that he would resign, a friend of mine and I, there was a note that was sent around the White House, and it said, "All unnecessary, non-essential personnel should leave at 5 o'clock. I made an executive decision. I was not non-essential by any means. In fact, I was probably more essential than anybody else, and so did a friend of mine who worked for the National Security Council. So what we did is he came over early, and I was in this little cubby hole that was down in the basement of the East Wing, and we hid there because apparently the president wanted to take a walk around the grounds and all this everybody was paranoid, and so we just stayed down there until the coast was clear. When we thought the coast was clear, boom, off we go, and we took a cut around the front area of the White House, and we went into the press room, and it was just filled. And the press room, as you may have read, had originally been a pool that had been put in by Franklin Roosevelt, and that Nixon had covered over. And they used to joke about the fact that if the press got too far out of line, all of a sudden it would slide, and there were sharks under there in the water. But what we did is we went down to the bottom of the pool, really down there. And you remember Art Buchwald. I'll never forget seeing him sitting there. He was making a bunch of Japanese journalists just howl. How that was working out, I don't know, but it was really hysterical. So eventually we figured it's okay, we can go up now. And so we went up to the press room, and we're standing around a little old television with all of these reporters. And my friend, who is a smart aleck, says he's not going to quit. This is about a minute before he goes on air. All of a sudden, every light around goes on, and the microphone is shoved in our faces. Connie Chung, who was with CBS, has one in my face. And I'm going, my friend's an idiot. Don't listen to anything that goes on. We finally get them all calmed down. Here's a strange thing about the next day, though. I went in early because I thought there was going to be a lot going on. And I went in, and the place seemed like nothing had happened and that nothing was going to happen. It was quiet. It was the early morning hours. It seemed like the White House on any other day. And then everything started to get crazy once again. We gathered together in the East Room. You've seen the photos of that in old films probably, which was as hot as Hades. I was sweating so much at one point that I wiped my nose with my tie, to which a woman turned around and said, it just berated the living daylights out of me for being such a slob. And I'm going like, I'm just trying to survive here like everybody else is. The Nixons came in the room and were given a standing ovation. And that standing ovation went on for, I think, 8 or 9 minutes. And then the president gave his speech, and there was yet another standing ovation as they went out. Then we all filed out. And we went out onto the South Lawn, and you've seen those pictures over the years. And we stood out there. It was a misty morning. It was hot, humid. Washington was built in a swamp, and you have swamp weather in the summertime. It was absolutely miserable. But you know, there are a lot of people that even in the face of things deny everything that's going on. And so as the Nixons and the Fords had walked to the helicopter, and the president had gotten up onto the steps of Army One and had given his famous wave, there was a woman that was standing next to a friend of mine, just a couple of people away. We were over to the left of the first family. And she said, he's coming back, you know. Like, what? Now, this is going on as the helicopter is now taking off, and it's starting to go and disappearing back behind the Washington Monument. They're going to Andrews Air Force Base. So, like, what are you talking about? The president has been through difficult times before, and what he's going to do is he's going to turn that helicopter around, and he's going to come back and land it, and he's going to have information that's going to just blow everybody's mind, and that's going to be it, and he's going to be right back in. To which a friend of mine looked at and goes, nah, I don't think so. And we realized that she had kind of at least one, if not two, leaks in her canoe. And the weird thing was we never saw her again. We don't know who she was or who ever showed up. About an hour later, President Ford took the oath of office, and you could almost feel that the air got lighter. It's interesting in how humanity, the force of humanity in one room that was so emotional now became emotional, but in a completely different way as President Ford took the oath of office. You know, it was interesting because President Nixon left with still 25% approval rating, which is kind of an amazing thing. But it was very sad. There were a lot of people who were in tears. And there were also tears of joy that President Ford had taken office. The Fords, I will tell you, simply were also wonderful people. There's a very funny story about what the dog did to me one day because I had a habit of putting hot dogs and food in my pockets, and the dog went nuts. Liberty, the dog. Chevy Chase used to make fun of him on Saturday Night Live, and they'd knock over the dog. You may have seen that a long time ago. Whatever. But I'd like to close with one story about a friend of mine who was named Fred Jefferson. Fred was a White House butler, and Fred had been there for a very long time. He had actually come to the White House when Eisenhower was president. He'd come with President Eisenhower specifically because he had worked for President Eisenhower when Ike was the Supreme Commander, and he had been a valet for him at that time. Actually, one of the reasons that Fred and I got to be such good friends is we were both from Georgia, although I don't sound like it anymore, and he had actually started his career of sorts as Bobby Jones' chauffeur. He met Dwight Eisenhower on the golf course, and when World War II came, Ike took him, and the rest was history. And he ended up staying there actually until the Carter administration, and then he retired. Fred had more stories than anybody I ever knew, and we figured that at least half of them, if half of them were true, he needed to write a book. He was also a very thoughtful individual about what was going on in the country. So one day, this is about 2 days before the end of the Nixon administration, he came to me and he said, Don, I want you to just come walk with me. And so we went out of the East Wing and we came around through the area, what's usually a public area of the White House, and we walked up the stairs and we walked into the East Room. And there we went to the window that looked out onto Pennsylvania Avenue, the one closest to the big door. And out there were the crowds, and they were yelling, impeach him and run him out of town, and he should resign. And one of the things that struck me also were the car horns, because in those days Pennsylvania Avenue was open to traffic. And people were honking their horns, responding to signs that said, honk if you think he should resign. So I looked at this and I listened to it, and it was a cacophony. It gave you a headache. Believe me, if the people outside knew, you could hear it inside the White House. There was no question about it. So I turned to Fred and I said, Fred, why did you bring me here? And he looked at me and he said, I brought you here because you're going to remember this the rest of your life. This is what democracy looks like. And it did then, and it still does now. And thank you very much for coming today.